We're about to get started, so if everyone could please take their seats. Excellent. Thank you guys so much for coming. I'm very happy to introduce Terry Levine, President of the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society.
All I can say is, wow. This is fantastic. Seeing so many people here tonight is just the most wonderful tribute to us in our city and to the program that you're going to be privileged to hear this evening. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society's first Shirley Berman Memorial Lecture in person in over 4 years. It's been ages since we've been able to get together because of COVID. I'm really thrilled to finally be able to do so, and I'm sure you will be delighted with this evening's program. As you look around this room tonight, you'll see that we are pretty much a full house. I want to acknowledge Kehillah Beth Israel, who postponed their program scheduled for this evening because they had participants who wanted to come here as well. So let's give them a little bit of applause. KBI's event, 3 days in October, will be held June 18th for those who are interested. A huge thank you to all who are involved. Before I go any further, I want to say a huge thank you to Tegan Goldsmith, our Executive Director, for making this all work. And there were many things that happened at the 11th hour, and as you can see, everything fell into place. Some members of the Jewish community conducted businesses in the Byward market. Many of us who are here this evening are boomers. And as boomers, the market was there. It was a fascinating place. Members of the community conducted businesses. They sent their children to school, to Hebrew school, celebrated life's joys and sorrows, all within the perimeter of Lowertown. The Byward market was right smack in the middle of this, and the lives of many families grew out of that association. We are honored to have John Diener, who has agreed to tell the story, or part of the story, of the market this evening. His family has been in business here for almost 70 years, or maybe it is 70 years now, or pretty close. His comments and personal experience are what this evening is all about. There are many people who I want to thank for making this evening possible. First and foremost, to the KBI Legacy Fund for providing us with the sponsorship to cover the cost of tonight's proceedings. To the Greenberg Families Library and Carly McPherson, thanks also for providing the wherewithal to produce much of the merchandise we have on sale here this evening. Make sure you take a look. There just might be something you want to have as a memento. Also, I want to bring to your attention, although you probably can't miss it, Creative Kosher and David Smith have provided our refreshments this evening. Please don't forget to help yourselves. Just in case you were worried. To those of you who sent anecdotes and photos of days gone by to be included in this presentation, thank you. You, our members, and friends who I hope will soon become members, believe in our mandate, which is to educate, provide programming, and preserve and promote the Jewish history of Ottawa while supporting the Ottawa Jewish Archives. Without your interest and support, we would face a very difficult task. So I want to thank you all for being here this evening to show your interest and support for what we are doing at this point. And I want to ask each and every one of you to consider what we need to do and what we want for the future. It would be wonderful if you would make a commitment to ensure that the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society is able to continue to function, doing the things that are of interest to the community, to work within our mandate. We are asking you for your personal involvement and generosity. Our programs are presented to you at no cost, because our mission statement is to make them available to anyone who wants to attend, regardless of their financial situation. We want to be able to continue to give you the types of events you have enjoyed in the past, and we sincerely believe you should have for the future, while keeping our mission intact. On behalf of the Board of Directors, I am asking you to consider making a donation to the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society to help ensure that funds are readily available for us to create innovative programming and events that the entire community will enjoy and benefit from for many years to come. Tax receipts for your donations over $18 will be provided, and you will know that you have had a hand in securing the future of OJHS programs. I'm not asking anyone to give until it hurts, only until it helps. Please consider a worthwhile donation. Remember, we still have expenses to make these events happen. Just had to change script. Now comes the good part. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker and Vice President of the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society, John Deenan. John was born and raised in Ottawa, and like many of us, is a proud member of the Blues. Raised in a close-knit, hard-working family, he learned early on that a work ethic is a good thing. He says he started working in the store with his dad on weekends when he was just a kid. John spent 3 years at Carleton studying for a Bachelor of Commerce. Then he decided that he would transfer to Algonquin to study data processing. When his father was getting ready to retire, he approached John about taking over the business, and he agreed. Like everything John does, he did it well. He not only started running the business, but he expanded its reach beyond the city. John is now a key player in the everyday life of several businesses in the market. He is innovative and has a keen eye for what the public want. He learned about working with the public and people skills and charting his way through the machinations and dilemmas of a family business. These were and are priceless gems for him to have at his disposal. John has a genuine interest in history and genealogy. He is a contributing member of a number of organizations and boards, like the Jewish Genealogical Society of Ottawa. He was a major organizer of the huge renovation that took place at the Jewish Memorial Gardens and remains active in that organization to this day. In the early 2000s, John and Jaime Reichstein took on the task of creating an online database of all the Jewish graves in the city. Today, that means that each has been photographed, and if we want to find something out, we can search for it. Every year, John makes it his business to see the dishes updated with new arrivals. We are very fortunate to have an individual like John working to ensure our history is safe and secure and available for generations to come. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you this evening's guest speaker, John Diener.
And thank you everyone for coming out tonight. And just so you know, a lot of what Terry said about me is true, but not everything. Before I begin, I'd like to thank all of those who reached out to me through the Historical Society to offer some of the information I will speak about tonight. At the same time, I want to apologize to the many families who aren't mentioned in my presentation. There were so many Jewish businesses in the Byward market and so many descendants of those business owners over the last century that it's absolutely impossible to speak about everyone in one session. I think there's lots of material available for a future talk. Actually, I gotta remember to advance these slides. So this one's just showing you some of the names that might or might not be mentioned tonight. In 1891, the Jewish population of Ottawa was only about 400, and at the turn of the century, about 1,800. Over the next 20 to 30 years, the population doubled, with so many Jews arriving in Canada to avoid the pogroms in Eastern Europe. Most of Ottawa's early Jews lived in the area surrounding the downtown Byward market area of Lower Town. Many became peddlers, and being close to the market area made it easier to sell or access sellable merchandise and produce. Rents were low, and eventually those peddlers, who initially operated with a horse and wagon, moved up and were able to rent stores, often living behind or above the stores. A license to peddle in Ottawa cost only $9 per year, compared to the $40 for a peddler on foot in Montreal, and $100 in that city for one with a horse-drawn cart or wagon. Once they operated from stores, many of the families lived above the store. A community was developing in the few square blocks that made up the Byward market. Some of the family surnames in our 21st century Ottawa Jewish community today started with an ancestor who was a peddler. Those names include Dover, Kaplan, Schenkman, Mirsky, Loeb, and Friedman. However, as you can see in this slide, compiled in 1950, there were way more than just these few names. I'm going to now fast forward to the 1960s. It was in this decade that I really got to know the market, because at the age of about 12 years old, I started helping my dad in our family business, Saslow's Meat Market. At that time, there were 15 stores. Well, somebody got it already, okay? There were 15 stores on the west side of the Byward Market Square, on the block between York Street to the north and George Street to the south. 13 of those 15 were Jewish owned. The two stores that were like the bookends to that city block were Irving Rivers at the corner of Byward and York, and Zunders at the other end of the block at the corner of Byward and George. We should call this, or we could call this part of the talk, as from the rivers to the Z for Zunders. That's the only political comment I'm making tonight. Maybe. Now, starting at York Street, I'm going to go up that block. First store at the corner, Irving Rivers, owned by the iconic Irving Rivers, selling work clothes and uniforms. This store has the slogan, "We corner the market." Very appropriate for a store at the corner of York and Byward. It is still a major tourist destination in Ottawa, carrying Canadian and Ottawa souvenirs, as well as clothing and flags of the world. More about Irving later. The next store on the block was a small store, owned by Earl Greenberg, known as Earl's Dairy. It was a tiny store selling deli meats, cheeses, and dairy products. And you can see it there in the slide on the bottom. It's in the middle between two stores. I remember Earl well because much of what he sold there was purchased from our store and resold by him. He didn't have enough volume to buy on his own, so he would buy from us. Earl's wife Ruth worked with him in the store. My recollections of Earl was that he was a quiet man, but you didn't mess around with Ruth, as can be seen in this newspaper article. She warded off an intended robbery at the store, and that got picked up in the paper. This is the original location of our store, Sasloff Meat Market, originally owned by Sam Sasloff, but taken over by my father, Nathan Diener, around 1954. We were at 30 Byward for many years, but then moved to 50 Byward about 25 years ago. More about our family business later in the presentation. Next door to us was Cooper Smith's Cut Rate Store. You can't see it in this picture because this picture was taken later, but it's where Budapest is on the far right of the picture. Cooper Smith's Cut Rate Store was owned by Saul and Selma Cooper Smith. I remember it as a long, narrow store with an aisle down the middle and clothing piled high on both sides. The Cooper Smiths sold clothing, but Saul's father, Benjamin, operated a fruit store going back to the late 1920s or early 1930s. Their store, as I said, was in the location where you see Budapest. Reliable Meat Market was owned by Sam Sobkoff. I remember Sam as a short-tempered man who had little tolerance for difficult customers. I once saw him chase a woman down the block with a knife in his hand because the piece of cheese he cut off the big wheel weighed 1.25 pounds. She refused to buy it because she only wanted 1 pound and not 1 ounce over. I remember that very clearly because he came into our store with the knife in his hand to ask if she bought cheese from us, which she had. Luckily for me, our cutting was more precise. Next door to Reliable was Greenberg and Weltman, a produce store owned by Mutt Greenberg and Morris Weltman. Later, Mr. Weltman left that business and opened Top Banana, which was around the corner at George and William. The Weltman name was dropped as the store name changed to Greenberg's Fruit Market. One long-time employee was Morris Coleman, who you see in the picture, who went by the nickname Mush, meaning this was the only store in Ottawa, I believe, maybe in the world, that had both a mutt and a mush. In talking to Mush's son Barry a few weeks ago, he reminded me of the Ramona Cafe, which was run by a Greek family for many decades. It was across the street from all of our stores. It was a gathering place for many of the Jewish retailers who would talk business and world events over lunch. Barry reminded me that his dad would bring a tomato or some other vegetable to the restaurant at lunchtime, and the restaurant people would slice it and put it on a plate with whatever main course he ordered. I know that some of the Jewish butchers would occasionally bring a steak with them to the restaurant, which the restaurant would cook for them. They would only have to pay for the side dishes and the beverages that they consumed, as they provided their own protein. That restaurant served as a community gathering place for the market merchants. Next door was Byward Bargain Center, a clothing store owned by Sam and Lima Magidson. Sam had a reputation as an excellent salesman. His store was one of the first in the city to take Chargex, which he promoted in his advertisements. Chargex was the forerunner to Visa, and I recall that several years later, our store was one of the first food stores in the city to accept credit cards. We were taking Visa even before the supermarkets did. Next to the Magidson store was Ballin's Grocery, originally owned by Jack and Betty Ballin, who you can see in the middle. In 1967, Jack and Betty were retiring, and like we did with our business, their son Fred and his wife Esther took over the store. It became a popular shop carrying the largest variety of cheeses in the city. They ran the store until they sold it and retired in 1985. It is still in operation today under the name International Cheese, but not with Jewish owners. Byward Meat Market, excuse me. I can recall Izzy Cohen and his brothers. This store, by market standards of the day, was quite large and modern, with most of the meat offerings prepackaged like we see in today's supermarket displays. Before the brothers ran the store, their father, Max Cohen, started out as a meat peddler before opening a store in the market around 1915. He sold that business to Michael Sobkoff in 1921. For the next decade or so, Max operated businesses in a few locations in the region, but eventually returned to the Byward market. I can still picture Izzy walking down the block in the market with a cigar hanging out of his mouth. Next door to Byward Meats was Economy Dairy, run by the Steinmans, Nat and Thelma. As a youngster, Thelma helped in her parents' store, the Rivers family store, in the Byward market. She married Nat in 1937, and the couple worked together in the store for several decades. Next door to that was Central Meat Market, owned by Wolf Cantor, and was in various locations on the block, but eventually it ended up at 50 Byward. It was later owned by Ronnie Cantor, Wolf's son, and when Ronnie got out of the business, it was taken over by Marvin Siegel, a brother-in-law to Danny, who was another of Wolf's sons. This picture shows, you can see 54 and 60 highlighted because the Zunders had two stores on the block. The store at 54 was originally owned by Isaac Zunder and his wife Bessie, but was taken over by their three sons, Sam, Mark, and Sroul. Sroul ended up making Aliyah to Israel. According to Sam's son Philip, the store at 54 Byward was expanded when they took over 52 Byward to make a larger store. With the extra space, they were able to add cigarettes, biscuits, and candy to the fruit and vegetable lines, as well as running a snack bar in the expanded location. And here you see the store at the corner that they bought. Around 1968, they bought the property at 60 Byward and kept that location's produce store running for about 25 years. Sam suffered from retinitis pigmentosa and gradually became blind, but that didn't stop him. I don't even know if it slowed him down. Like Irving Rivers, he became a spokesperson for the market retailers, and despite his vision problems, he functioned very well. He would walk the streets of the market and knew all the farmers and the store people by their voices and location. Years after he got out of business, he would call me regularly for updates on his beloved Byward market. And here you see, like me and my siblings, and many other children of storekeepers, Philip helped his dad in the store, and he met his wife Linny there for the first time while working there. He also told me that one day, Margaret Trudeau was shopping in the store, and I had her hand slapped by a female employee when she sampled a grape from the display. This feature that you see on the screen appeared in the newspaper in 1986, 62 years after the establishment of the business. Slipikoffs, produce and meat, originally owned by Sam Slipikoff, then his son Charlie and wife Mary, later by son Jerry, and even later than that, joined by Jerry's brothers David and Harvey. This store was sandwiched between the two Zunder stores. When Sam operated the store, it was actually called Byward Fruit Market, as can be seen in Devoira's obituary from 1943. At some point, probably after Charlie took it over, it was renamed Slipikoff's. Many years later, a store with no connection to the Slipikoff family took on the Byward Fruit Market name, where Greenberg's once was, and has been operating as Byward Fruit Market for the past 25 years. As I said, the current owners have no connection to the Slipikoffs. Now, 60 years later, in 2024, of the 13 Jewish-owned businesses on that side of the street in the 1960s, only 3 remain today. One is our store, which is probably closing this fall after 70 years of business. On the bottom, you see a scene from the Rivers store, which is still there, cornering the market. Irving's daughter Ellen and his grandson Michael Oster running the place. The store that was Greenberg and Weltman in the 60s went through a couple of ownership changes, and as I said before, it was renamed Byward Fruit Market. Miriam and Isaac Farbiaz have now owned that store for the past quarter century. I guess these pictures were taken during COVID. Across the street, at the southern end, were Schulman's, with Joe Schulman and his wife Faye and their children working in the store. Next to Schulman's was Ontario Fruit, originally owned by Philip Sweetco. Philip immigrated to Canada in the 1920s and worked as a newsie on the train selling newspapers before setting up in the fruit business. Later, Philip turned the reins over to his son Irving, known as Little Irving, and son-in-law Irving Berkovich, known as Big Irving. In this 1989 Ottawa Citizen feature, Irving talks about having to get up at 3 a.m. to drive to Montreal to purchase the best produce, and then to rush back to Ottawa to unload and set up the store for the day's business, something he did for many years. By the time this feature appeared in the paper, there were now 3 stores and were rebranded as the Fresh Fruit Company. And I'm happy to see Irving here today, and I see Barry Schulman's here today as well. Schulman's and Ontario Fruit were next door to each other at the south end of the market building, and were both in the produce business. I used to hear stories, I don't know if they're true, about one store putting out a sign with a special price for an item, and the other would respond a few minutes later with a sign placing that item a few pennies cheaper. Evidently, they would go back and forth until one of them finally gave up. And maybe one of you can verify if that's true or not. At the far end of the block, on the right side of the picture, you can't see the storefront, there was Ottawa Meat and Fish, owned by Abraham Sasloff. Around 1964, he moved his business to what was then Eastview, or now Vanier, and later to Belfast Road. For many decades, it was the major wholesaler of meat and seafood, serving most restaurants in the Ottawa area. Sam Sasloff, who was my father's original partner, and his son-in-law, Maury Karp, joined Abe Sasloff at OMF after Sam left our business. In addition to the Jewish-owned butcher shops in the area, there were several more with non-Jewish owners, totaling about 12 or 13 stores, selling basically the same or very similar products. In those days, Ottawa didn't have supermarkets in every neighborhood like today. Families were larger, and in most cases, the women were at home cooking substantial meat meals almost every day. And most importantly, meat was actually affordable to most. It should be noted that from more than a dozen butcher shops 60 years ago, we are the last one standing. The volume of meat, fish, and produce sold on that one block was considerable, as so many shopped in the market from all over the region. On Monday morning, the beef trucks, the produce trucks, they would come to the market, restocking all the stores after a busy weekend. The beef trucks were there all morning, unloading the quarters of beef destined for the stores. The market was the place to shop and drew thousands of customers every week, the busiest day being Saturday. My 94-year-old mother, who passed away exactly a month ago, always talked about how it would take her 15 minutes to walk from our store near the corner of York Street, a short distance to Zunder's at the George Street end of the block, because of the huge crowds shopping at the stores or at the outdoor vendor stalls. There were a couple of families in my day who had a huge presence in the market. The Saslovs, for one. They were originally Zaslavsky from Uman, Ukraine. Their patriarch, Jacob, and his wife Hannah arrived in Canada after World War I. They and 5 of their children stayed in Ottawa, and 2 ended up in New York. Jacob became a kosher butcher and set up shop on St. Patrick's Street, east of King Edward, so not quite in the market. However, their 5 children who had stayed in Ottawa all had businesses in the heart of Byward Market. As mentioned before, our store was originally owned by Sam Sasloff. Sam's brother Morris started Albert's Meat Market with his wife Edith's brothers, Morton and Archie Toller. They were located on Mosgrove Street. He eventually split up with the Tollers and changed the Mosgrove store name to Morris Sasloff Meats. That made things a little confusing for us because there were 2 Sasloff meat markets in the market. And we used to ask my father, why did you leave the name? He said, well, if somebody gets a tough steak, they'll call the other one. When Mosgrove Street was expropriated to build the Rideau Center, Morris Sasloff Meats moved to George Street. The Tollers moved Albert's Meat Market to William Street. They were very innovative with coolers on an upper level of the building with motorized rails that would bring the beef up to those coolers. While many of the butcher shops in the market were like what you would have seen decades earlier, Albert's was way ahead of the game with the way they prepared and displayed their merchandise. As previously mentioned, Abe Saslov had started Ottawa Meat and Fish, originally at 49 Byward. Like Brother Morris, he also married a taller, another sister of Morgan, Archie, and Edith. So two Saslov brothers were married to two taller sisters. Another Saslov, Betty, married Jack Ballin, and they ran Ballin's Grocery on St. Patrick's Street in the 30s and then at 40 Byward, where it remained for decades. Sister Mary Saslov was married to Charlie Slipikoff, and they ran their store at 56 Byward. So if you're keeping count, there were 5 stores owned by 5 siblings, all running at the same time. Another family that had a large presence in the market was the Rivers family. Irving was at 16 Byward. Irving's wife Ethel was a sister to Mike Greenberg's wife Minnie. The Greenbergs owned the produce store at 36 Byward. Irving's sister was Thelma Steinman, who ran Economy Dairy at 48 with her husband. And another of Irving's sisters was Goldie, married to Morris Cantor, who was in the meat business on St. Patrick's Street, but whose brother owned and operated Central Meat Market. So you can see there are a few families that have very large presence in the area. Now let's travel back in time from the 1960s to the earlier years. A talk about the Jewish history of the market would not be complete if we left out the story of Jacob Friedman. On the wall outside my store is an historical plaque honoring Jacob Friedman. This is what it says. Jacob Friedman, merchant, well bought, half sold. Born April 15, 1865, in the Ukraine, he arrived in Ottawa in 1891 and established himself in the Byward market. An entrepreneur of extraordinary talent, vision, honesty, and capacity for hard work, his wholesale grocery business became the largest, most successful in Eastern Ontario, as well as Canada's first cash and carry. Internationally recognized, he held a seat on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. Here on Byward Square and later on George Street, he conducted his personal, real estate, and philanthropic affairs, surrounded by dedicated, loyal family and employees. He passed away in 1957. This plaque commemorates the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the Jacob and Leah Friedman family in the city of Ottawa. Jacob Friedman's first business was J. Friedman Wholesale Produce, located at 42 and 45 George Street. Between 1903 and 1929, he acquired most of the income-producing property in Byward Market Square. Jacob assisted extended family members in opening businesses there. In 1921, relatives Abraham and Dora Lithwick arrived in Ottawa, and with Jacob's help, got their business started in the market. A little later, other extended family members, the Coopersmiths, Eisenbergs, and Greenblatts, also started produce businesses and rented stores from Jacob. Friedman did extremely well and invested his profits in other properties in Ottawa. In the book A Common Thread, which is the history of the Ottawa Jewish community, which I believe is available for purchase from the Society here tonight,
Yes.
his grandson, Lawrence Friedman, mentions that Jacob was in New York in the summer of 1929 and noticed that New York wholesalers had stopped buying. He sensed that something was up, and he telegraphed home immediately to tell his staff to stop buying. When the market crashed in November, beginning the Great Depression, his Ottawa warehouse was empty, except for lots of cash and receivables. With this cash, he was able to buy product for next to nothing and sell to supply his customers. He was also able to extend credit to them, allowing them to get back on their feet during this very difficult economic period. As the only Jew on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, Jacob would travel to Chicago every November and was able to buy commodity futures on butter, eggs, and potatoes. He was well known for his knowledge of agricultural markets, farmers, and the weather forecasts. He was also the first member of the Ottawa Jewish community to establish a charitable foundation in his will, and he left $400,000 upon his death in 1957 for distribution to Jewish and non-Jewish institutions in Ottawa. Our family has been renting from Jacob's descendants for 70 years. I won't even try to calculate how much rent we paid over those decades, but we'll say that the family has always been good to us and are exceptional landlords, following the good example set by Jacob a century ago. His descendants have continued to succeed doing what Jacob started in both business and philanthropic endeavors in Ottawa and beyond. Another prominent Byward Market personality comes from the Rivers family. Well, Jacob Rivers came to Canada with Leah, his wife, in 1921. Almost immediately, he rented a stand in the market. By 1924, he had enough saved to rent a store at 16 Byward Market, which you can see in the picture, where he sold fruits and vegetables, both wholesale and retail. That business was named J. Rivers Fruits. In 1946, the fruit store gave way to a clothing store, which Jacob ran with son Albert. In 1950, Irving took over and renamed the store after himself. He adopted the slogan, "We corner the market," for his shop, which is still displayed prominently today. Irving sold work clothing and supplied uniforms for many Ottawa businesses. He became known as Mr. Market and acted as a spokesman representing market businesses in their dealing with the city and with the media. His message to the politicians of the day was, "Leave the market alone." At some point, he got into the flag business. Perhaps it was in 1965 when the new Canadian flag was introduced. You can see in this ad from the Citizen that year when he recognized an opportunity. It's interesting that Irving's ad appeared in the Ottawa Citizen right beside my dad's ad promoting rib steaks and roast for 59 cents a pound. For those of you who think in metric, that's $1.30 a kilo. Note that today's rib steaks sell for $40 a kilo in our store, and I can assure you that the profit margins were higher in 1965 than they are today. It's also worth noticing that my dad, I don't know if you can read the fine print, my dad offered free city-wide delivery, but it came with a catch. The catch was that you had to spend a minimum of $5 before qualifying for free delivery. As well as being Mr. Market, Irving was very prominent within the Jewish community, serving on many boards, in particular Congregation Beth Shalom and the JCC. For many years, he organizes the buses that would take many of us to camp every summer. That was Camp in Brith. The buses would line up in the market on the first day of camp, which was usually the first Sunday after Canada Day. In those days, almost all businesses were closed on Sundays, so there was plenty of room not only for the camp buses, but also for parking for the cars of all the parents dropping off their children. It was like a little party there on that Sunday. Irving ran those camp send-offs with military precision, and you would hear about it if you didn't act quickly when he told you it was your time to board the bus. Personally, our family was very close to Irving as his store was next to ours, and we remained very close to Irving's children and many of his grandchildren. After my brother Joel and I took over our business from our parents, Irving used to come into our store several times a week to make sure that everything looked orderly and to offer us some of his wisdom. One of the things he insisted on in our store was when placing bills in our cash register, all the bills had to be face up with the Queen's head pointing the same way. We heard about it if you did an inspection and it wasn't there. He also reminded us not to leave too much money in the register in case we ever got robbed, which fortunately never happened. I think that he felt with my dad not being in the store every day, at this point in his life, Irving had to keep an eye on us, making sure that we were acting responsibly. The Rivers store is still going strong today. Clothing, uniforms, and flags are still a major part of the business, but the store is also a destination for tourists from around the world as they carry an extensive line of Ottawa and Canada souvenirs. Irving's daughter Ellen took over from Irving back in the 90s and still goes into the store occasionally. It's true, Ellen. But is now run very well by Irving's grandson, Michael Oster, who has added his own touch to this Byward Market institution. So many of the Byward Market and Rideau Street stores were Jewish-owned that on the high holidays, almost all of them were closed. Sign maker Harry Kaufman used to make complimentary signs that went up in the windows of all the stores a few weeks before the high holidays, advising customers that the stores would be closed on the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah as well as on Yom Kippur. And his sign actually looked better. That was just something I put in there to to show what the signs used to say, but he was a graphic artist, I certainly am not. I can remember though, walking to the market on a Rosh Hashanah Saturday afternoon one year, after attending services at Beth Shalom, and seeing store after store closed, all displaying the same Harry Kaufman sign. Customers didn't seem to mind. I remember one year, Yom Kippur fell on the Saturday before Thanksgiving, which meant that we were going to be closed on what was probably the second busiest day of our year. We told all our customers in advance, and they all came in on Thursday or Friday to pick up their Thanksgiving turkeys, respecting our traditions. No one complained of being inconvenienced by the Jewish store owners observing their traditions. The Ottawa Jewish Archives has a wonderful collection of recorded interviews with members of the community. I've listened to a few of them, and one that I enjoyed featured Abe Hanser and was recorded in 1987. In it, Mr. Hanser, who was born in 1911, talked at great length about his life, just 3 years before he passed away in 1990. Again, while every family story differed slightly, the general theme is much the same for most. Abe's father, Daniel, an immigrant from Latvia, was a shoe repairman and operated a clothing and shoe store at 103 Clarence Street. Like many other families, the Hansers lived behind the store. In addition to the store, they kept a few geese, 40 or 50 hens in a stable located right behind the building. The geese were raised to be enjoyed on special occasions, perhaps for Simchat Torah or Rosh Hashanah. They also used the feathers for pillows. The chickens were raised for their eggs, of course, and to provide the main course for Shabbat dinners, and some were sold to neighbors and friends. If an observant Jew bought a live chicken or goose, they would take it to Reverend Mirsky, who was not only the shochet, but also the cantor at the King Edward Synagogue. Many in the community bought live poultry in the market to be slaughtered, usually on Thursdays, to be used for Shabbat, reminiscent of what was done in the shtetls of Eastern Europe. In 1926, Daniel Hanser died suddenly at the age of 48, and Abe's mother, Tilly, was left with 8 children. She took over the running of the store, as if she must have had lots of spare time on her hands with only 8 kids. She added glassware and dishes to her product list, and later dealt with furniture and antiques. In 1951, Tilly suffered a heart attack, and Abe decided to take over the store. Abe added TVs, radios, and stereos to what was sold at the store. The Hanser store was one of many similar stores, mostly on Clarence and on William Street. Abe went on to talk about some of the challenges that Jews faced in those days, especially in the lean Depression years. While for the most part Jews in the area got along reasonably well with their non-Jewish neighbors, there was some anti-Semitism, as many in both French and English Canada saw Jews as not fitting in or as carriers of left-wing ideas. As has often happened during lean economic times, many found that the Jews were convenient targets for hatred and as scapegoats. There were some factions who took out ads in papers encouraging people to boycott Jewish stores. Abe went on to mention an Ottawa City detective, Jean Tissot, a 25-year veteran of the Ottawa Police Force, who harassed the local Jewish merchants by visiting them every single day to see if they were selling stolen merchandise in their stores. In addition to this harassment, he circulated throughout the city an anti-Semitic cartoon translated to English from a French-language Quebec paper that was defaming A.J. Freeman. When Freeman complained, Tissot was charged with criminal libel and was suspended from the Ottawa Force and was found guilty, after which he resigned or was terminated, making life so much easier for the Jewish business people in the market. Tissot was then hired as police chief for Rouen, Quebec, but shortly thereafter he was let go once people there saw his true colors. Next door to Abe's store at 103 Clarence, I knew you'd be smiling, Joel. Next door to Abe's store at 103 Clarence lived his brother-in-law Nathan Lang. Nathan lived upstairs and ran the barbershop at street level for about 60 years. I can remember going to Nathan's for a haircut in the 60s for $1, which included tip. Nathan was featured in the 1980 article in the Citizen, and by then the price had gone up to $2.50. My brother Joel and I have very fond memories of Nathan, as he used to come into our store weekly to buy eggs. He also used to apologize for not buying meat, but he said he keeps kosher, so he couldn't buy from us. And he told us this every time he came in. We used to sell double double yolk jumbo eggs. Well, they were not guaranteed to be double yolk, but many of them were. Every time he came in, he would ask the same question in his deep voice. Double yolks? Fresh today? It was always the same. He would tell us on subsequent visits that only 10 of the dozen eggs had 2 yolks, and he always had to look at several dozen carefully before making his purchase. Nathan's wife, Anne, passed away in 1971, and Nathan continued to cut hair until 1987, when at age 87, the building that he and Abe occupied was sold. Some of his customers had been his customers for more than half a century. In 2017, the City of Ottawa completed the George Street Plaza Renewal Project. Highlights included the planting of shade trees and shrubs and the unveiling of a replica heritage clock. The plaza is the heart of the Byward market, where thousands gather weekly. Many visitors to the market tell their friends, "Meet me under the clock," and I see it every morning when I walk to the mailbox for my store. The replica clock was chosen as a link to the region's history. Watchmaker David Wilson displayed the original clock at his shop on Clarence Street in the 1930s, and after he died in the 1950s, it went to the Nathanson family's pawn shop, Sam's Buy and Sell on William Street, where the word pawnbroker was added to the clock face, and the 3 spears representing the pawnbroker's symbol were added to the bottom. The Nathanson family donated the clock to the Ottawa Jewish Archives, and because of their generosity, the city was able to commission a working copy that not only displays the present time, but also links it to the market's past. In the picture on the right, you can see me on the left as I acted as the intermediary between the city and the Ottawa Jewish Archives. In the middle is Sarah Mortensen, a former archivist at the Ottawa Jewish Archives, and on the right is Paula Wilson, granddaughter of David the clockmaker. And Paula's parents were estranged from Paula's grandparents, so Paula had never seen a picture of her grandfather until I was able to find one for her. Lily, I wanted to make sure you could see yourself. So. It's a good thing you're sitting in the front row. Earlier this month, I sat down with Lily Penso and interviewed her on her experiences growing up in the market. She is the daughter of Berchik, or Ben Greenberg, and Ida Kardish. Both of her parents were immigrants who, like so many, needed to learn English when they arrived in Canada. They took classes at York Street School. Berchik was originally a peddler, which was probably the most common occupation of the new Eastern European Jewish immigrants. He boarded his horse at Cundall Stables in the Byward Market. By the way, Cundall Stables is still in operation today on York Street, and quite often on the weekends, you'll see the horses drawing carts with kids through the market streets. Lily recalled there were many Jewish-owned pawn shops, clothing stores, and second-hand stores when she was younger. At age 12, in the mid-1940s, Lily went to work at the fruit store owned by Benjamin Coopersmith. Because of her age, she didn't handle the cash, but she helped people with their orders and refilled produce displays. Her salary was a grand $3 per day. The store was very hot in the summer and very cold in the winter, so in the cold months, she worked with her winter coat on. She told me there was a little stove in the store, so when it wasn't busy, she and the other employees would huddle around the stove to try to warm up. She remembers the store next door, which was Eisenberg's, another of the many Jewish-owned produce retailers. Lily recalled that most families maintained the traditions they brought with them from the old country. Her mother used to buy live chickens, usually on a Thursday, to prepare for Shabbat, and would take them to Reverend Mercy and later to Reverend Bornstein, who took care of the ritual slaughtering. Those very fresh birds would then be taken home to be plucked and cleaned. Lily told me that her house had a summer kitchen where all this preparation took place. I wasn't really familiar with the term summer kitchen, so I looked it up on Google, and it told me that it was a small building detached from the house. Its purpose was to keep the heat generated by cooking out of the main house in the hot summer months. Remember, chickens in those days were not like what we pick up today in a supermarket or butcher shop. They needed to be plucked and cleaned, which took place in the summer kitchen. Feathers would fly all over the place, making a mess. The pin feathers were not easily removed and had to be burned off with a candle. Even kosher chickens bought from the butcher had the pin feathers still on them, something that I remember my mother complaining about when she was preparing them many years ago. Lily also remembered quite vividly the annual tradition of kabarot, which was done between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. I remember learning about it as a child, but it was never done in our home. But it was done in many of the homes of the Lower Town Byward community in those days. The ceremony involved passing a live chicken over one's head 3 times while reciting the required text, with the intent of transferring any harsh decrees that might have been destined for you from above to the bird. The bird was normally slaughtered and given to needy families. Another item prepared for Shabbat is gefilte fish. The point fish, which was not Jewish owned and is still in operation today in the market, used to have a mashgiach on site on Thursdays, so women preparing for Shabbat could purchase their fresh fish, have them deboned and ground. The store kept special kosher knives, cutting boards, and a grinder that was specifically reserved for observant Jewish customers. In my time, I can still remember a few of the Jewish ladies that I used to see running around at the fish shop back in the 1970s. One important person in the community was the Iceman, Jacob Ages, who delivered ice daily to those in the community, as refrigerators were not common in those early years. And this is not a picture of Jacob. I just found a generic Iceman picture online. Lily told me what I had also heard from my mother, who grew up in Montreal, that it was very important to remember to empty the pan, or as they called it, the schissel, that collected the water under the icebox so that there wouldn't be a flood in the kitchen. York Street Public School had a very large percentage of Jewish students. Virtually all the kids from Lower Town ended up there. After school, there were classes for Jewish kids that took place at the Talmud Torah building on George Street. The younger kids would go from York Street School to the Talmud Torah building for classes that took place from 4 to 6 p.m. And the older kids went between 6 and 8 p.m. On evenings and weekends, the building served as a community center and social hall, where many romances and eventual marriages got their start. Lily told me that many of her generation used to enjoy going to the movies. The most popular theaters at the time were the Français Theatre on Dalhousie, which was named Français, but also showed English films, and for the Rideau Theatre on Rideau Street. She told me that for 15 cents, she got to see 2 movies, 1 newsreel, a cartoon, and a serial. There was also a Jewish theater guild that put on plays, such as Dybbuk, at the Talmud Torah building. Another spot to watch live theater was at the Liberty Theater on King Edward. I'm now going to talk a little bit about my recollections from my 60 years in the market. While this is specifically dealing with our family business, it will give you some insight into what a typical family business was like in the 60s and 70s. The stores were certainly not as fancy as today's, but were set up to run efficiently and smoothly, selling an amazing volume of product in a relatively small space. As I said, I'm going to use my family business as an example. While every family story is slightly different, they usually started with a new immigrant to Canada from Eastern Europe who ventured into business to support the family. In our case, it was my late father, Nathan Diener, a Holocaust survivor who came to Canada in 1948. After working for the Balin family at Ottawa Iron Works for a few years, he partnered with Jaime Gandel in a butcher shop called D&G Meats on Byward between York and Clarence, sort of where Zach Steiner is today. That didn't last long, as in 1954 or 1955, he joined Saslav's Meat Market as a junior partner to owner Sam Saslav. Shortly after joining Sam, my dad bought out Sam's share of the business. My brother Joel and I took it over from our parents 40 years ago, but as the oldest of 4 children, my involvement with the store and the market goes back to the mid-60s, when as a 12-year-old, I started helping out. My mom would drop me off at Beth Shalom Synagogue on Saturday mornings, and she would continue on to the store where she worked as a cashier on that very busy day. After shul, I would walk to the market and work until 6 p.m. I used to get paid 50 cents for the afternoon's work, which made me one of the richest kids in my class. My 3 siblings and I all spent weekends and summer vacations when we weren't away at camp at the store. And by the early 70s, when my sister was old enough to work the cash, all 6 of us could be found there on Saturdays. I just figured out now while I'm reading this why we we were only allowed to go to camp for the first half. It's because my dad wanted us in the store for most of the summer. While we did work, there was some fooling around. I recall one brother, whose name I won't mention, making little balls out of ground beef and throwing them in the air to see if they would stick to the ceiling, and filling up an employee's boots with sawdust. But for the most part, we behaved. We worked hard, it was fun. We often socialized with other kids our age on the block who were working for the parents, like the Zenders and the Greeners. While our store was competing with so many in proximity, there was enough business for all. Every store had its own loyal customer base. The competition was friendly, and we had arrangements with most of the other butcher shops, whereby if we needed something for an order, we would run down the street and borrow the cut we were looking for. And of course, this arrangement went both ways. Our two favorite stores to trade with were Morris Saslav Meats, where Al Shapiro and Phil Lazier were always happy to help, and Slibakov's, where Jerry used to say, "Go into my cooler, kid, grab whatever you want." He didn't even mark down what we took. I kept track of what we took from him as well as he took from us. And when the list got long, we'd get together and calculate the difference. It was a great way to do business and benefited all of us. My dad was an amazing salesman, just like many of the first generation who were operating stores in the market. He would spot strangers on the sidewalk, looking at our impressive display in the refrigerated window. He would walk outside, strike up a conversation with a complete stranger, and invite the person into the store. More often than not, these people ended up walking out with bags of meat and became regular customers after that first encounter. Because of his wartime experiences in Eastern Europe, he spoke many languages, making him popular with Italian, Polish, Ukrainian, Russian, and German speakers. His French was not great, but it didn't stop him from speaking it with many of the French-Canadian customers. He used to say, "I speak lots of languages, but not one of them good." Most of the shop owners in the market, especially the generation that were born in Eastern Europe, were amazing salespersons, and they had come over with nothing, so wanted to work hard to provide for their family. There was a Dominion supermarket on the block between York and Clarence. That's also the block where Zach's Diner and Lux are located today. Often a customer would ask my dad for something like a frozen turkey that we might not have had in stock that day. My dad would tell the customer, "Yeah, we have them. They're in our warehouse around the corner." And then he'd send one of us to run to the so-called warehouse to go get one. That was a code for one of us to hurry to the Dominion store, grab the turkey, pay for it at their cash, rip the price stickers off the bird as we ran back to our store, and bring it to my father to sell to the customer. Everybody left happy. Looking at the picture, on the left you see Economy Clothing, which was owned by the Shanebaums, Rubens Paint, the Rubin family, and in the bottom right, you see a little bit of the Slovers department store. After Economy Clothing shut down, since we're on this block, the Jewish-owned Pragery restaurant operated there, and also, as I mentioned, on the block are Zach's, which used to have Jewish ownership, and Blue Cactus, which is still owned and operated by the Firestone family. Working in the market was a great bonding experience and taught us many important lessons. We learned about business, about customer service, and most of all, how to work hard, lessons that served us well for the rest of our lives. We also learned that not everyone was like us. We were exposed to people from all walks of life and served the who's who of Ottawa, including politicians and ambassadors and their chefs, as well as those on welfare. My parents became personal friends with many customers from all walks of life, including the High Commissioner of New Zealand and his wife, people who shopped in our store in person, including Prime Ministers Diefenbaker and Clark. And I remember Joe Clark walking in before Christmas to pick up a turkey, and there were a lot of people there before him, and everybody said, "Oh, go ahead first, we know who you are." And he said, "No, I'll wait my turn like everybody else." We also supplied meats to the chefs at 24 Sussex in the Paul Martin, Jean Chrétien, Stephen Harper, and the current Justin Trudeau days. And we've been selling to Rita Hall, supplying Governor Generals for probably about 30 years. We also supplied the Archbishop of Ottawa's residence for at least 15 years, and provided meat that was used when Canada was hosting US presidents and British royalty. Personally, as you can see in the picture on the bottom, I was chosen to represent downtown businesses by greeting Prince Charles and Camilla 2 years ago this month. I don't know if you can see the guy standing behind Camilla. That's my son who's holding my grandson. At the other end of of the social scale, in my dad's days, he offered credit to those less fortunate. And that was common with all the market stores at the time. At the end of the month, when these customers received their checks, my dad would cash them and then deduct what was owed to him. He treated rich and poor the same way, always with respect. These were the days before the use of credit and debit cards, and after a busy Saturday, my mother would collect home thick piles of cash in her purse, mostly $5, $10, the occasional $20 bill, that they would sort out on the weekend and then take to the bank on Monday. Rarely did you see a $50 or $100 bill in those days. I remember my dad telling me that if a customer wanted a paper shopping bag and they bought it for less than $5, we had to charge for the bag. I think it was 3 cents or something. Keep in mind that 60 years ago, when we sold ground beef at 3 pounds for $1, you got an awful lot of meat for $5. In the 60s, when I started helping, things were quite different from now. Here are a few recollections from our store that are hard to believe today, but then again, times were very different. Conditions were similar in many of the other stores. Like most butcher shops, we used sawdust on the floor of our cooler to soak up any blood that might have dripped from the hanging quarters of beef. In the winter, sawdust took on another task, as it was spread thickly in the front of the store to soak up snow and ice tracked in by customers. I guess we didn't believe in mopping in those days. At the end of the day, the wet sawdust was swept away, and miraculously, the tile floor was spotless. That always amazed me. The wet sawdust with the grit picked up all the dirt. Of course, sawdust stayed on the bottom of our shoes or boots, and we were warned by our mother not to track that into our house when we returned home. Our family car also had to be vacuumed regularly. Many items that today require refrigeration were kept out in the open on top of the counter all day to make them more visible to customers. They were put back in the coolers at night. My dad always had an open 6-pound box of loose hot dogs at one end. And you can see that this box of hot dogs there, but I guess he closed it because Ed Broadbent was breathing on it. That is Ed Broadbent, and I can just imagine it was before an election campaign, I think in 1978 or 1979. And my father was probably saying something like, "Your damn unions." Anyway, people would order hot dogs from the box and from other things that were on top of the counter. But that box was very popular with children, as my father would reach into it and grab one to give to the child while the parents shopped. Kids knew that they would get that treat, and they expected it. And my father was a friend to all of them. Even 5 decades later, adults would come into the store and tell me that they remembered the nice man who gave them the hot dogs when they were kids. It should be noted that no gloves were worn in food establishments. In those days, and you would never think to ask a parent for permission to give something to the child. It was just what you did. Employees would serve the customer by picking their chosen meat items from the counter, handle the cash, then serve the next customer. No gloves, no hand washing, and no issues with the health inspectors over those practices. And we did have inspections, though these were commonplace. Most of the butchers smoked while working. I vividly recall them cutting or trimming steaks, just like this guy, who's not one of our employees, somebody I found online, with a cigarette hanging out of their mouths. The ashes often dropping onto the meat, and then getting scraped away as they scraped the bone dust off the meat. When a customer needed to speak to one of the butchers, the employee would leave a cigarette on the counter in the back, a wood counter, which over the years had countless burn marks from the abandoned cigarettes. What is difficult to believe today is that our store in those early days did not have a hot water tank. Every afternoon, a pail of water was taken downstairs and put on a hot plate and brought up for the end of the day cleaning time. Because everything was closed on Sundays in those days, cleanup was much more thorough on Saturdays. So on that day, we used a pail, something like what you see in the picture, that when full weighed about 100 pounds. We used to fill it using a hose connected to an upstairs tap. Because of its weight, it took 2 people to bring it up the narrow stairway. It was so large that it was put on the hot plate early in the morning. By 5 o'clock, it was extremely hot, and it was a wonder that no one ever got scalded carrying it up the narrow stairway. If I remember correctly, somebody had an idea in the 70s that we should get a hot water heater installed. I don't know why it took so long. The store was heated, sort of what Lily said, about working in cold conditions. Our store was heated by a stove oil furnace that fed heat upstairs to one small grate at the front of the store, which meant that most of the store was quite cold in the winter. We had two 100-gallon drums in the basement and had to take oil from those tanks in a pail every day and pour it into the small reservoir attached to the furnace. I can still imagine the smell of the oil that stayed on our hands after filling the furnace. There was one incident in the early 60s when someone left a tap on one of the drums open, resulting in an oil spill discovered the next morning. That episode cost my dad a few bags of sawdust to soak it up and left the oily smell in the store for weeks. Because most stores were closed on Sunday, in fact all stores were closed on Sunday, my dad always drove downtown in the winter months to make sure the furnace was filled. He would come and take the pail and put oil in it and carry it over to the reservoir. While there, he also fed the cat, whose job it was to keep the mice away, something that was very common in the stores at that time. I won't go into any detail about the bathroom facilities, so we'll leave that to your imagination. Let me just say that in the years my mother worked in the store, which were many, she never once went down the stairs for anything, which included using the bathroom. She would walk over to Freeman's to use the facilities there. And she said Freeman's bathroom was pretty good in the morning, but in the afternoon, it wasn't so nice either. These conditions were not unique to our store and were common throughout similar businesses both here in Ottawa and elsewhere at the time. We never had issues with municipal health inspections, and we never heard of anyone getting sick. It's hard to believe looking at it from today's perspective. In the early 1980s, our parents were getting tired. They had worked 6 days a week for many years without vacations and were seriously considering closing the store. By that point, I had finished my education and was working full-time jobs outside the family business. These were Monday to Friday jobs, so because I had so much of the store in me, I continued to work at the store on Saturday to help my parents. I couldn't imagine the business closing, so my wife and I approached my parents about taking over the store. Joel at the time had graduated and was working for an MP on Parliament Hill. He decided to join me a year or two later, and we were partners together for approximately 40 years. Over the next few decades, we did very well, eventually opened a second store and a warehouse, and had a decent wholesale business as well, serving a couple of dozen restaurants. Joel and I both appreciated the hands-on education we got working in the family business. So when his 3 children and my 2 were old enough, they followed our example and worked weekends and summers in the stores. In fact, even children of the siblings, of my 2 siblings who weren't involved in business, most of their children worked at one point in the store as well. If my dad were here today, he would be immensely proud seeing that 9 of his 11 grandchildren put in time working for the family business while in high school. All of our children have done extremely well in their chosen careers, partly because of the work ethic instilled in them by their experiences in the store. Now Joel and I are both grandfathers, and the next generation is still too young to work in the store. I do have a picture of my grandson in the store taken 2 years ago, so we can now say that we've had 4 generations of Deaners behind the counter. Just as we wind down this talk, I will briefly mention a few other stores and businesses in the area. There were Jewish-owned businesses that dealt with furs and hides, like the Kisleys, who did business on York Street, and Dover and Black, where you can see upstairs from the Canadian Bank of Commerce, which is actually the future location of the Broken Rivers store. Often these furriers would buy pelts from local hunters and trappers and transform them into beautiful coats or accessories. There were kosher butchers in the market, of course. They included Badowski's at 13 Byward Market, Max Cohen, you can see in the middle, and on the right you see an invoice for 200 kosher meals and extras sold to the Ottawa Chevra Kadisha, I guess for their annual dinner, in 1957 by Mrs. Eva Goldfield of Ottawa Kosher Catering, for the very reasonable price of $653. And kosher too. In this picture you see Misha Zavar, who operated Ottawa Kosher Meat Market, and he also catered my bar mitzvah, and our parents used to shop at his store, even though we sold probably better meat in our store. Next to Ottawa Kosher, which is hardly visible in that picture, you see Ralph's Furniture Store. Ralph Sternberg owned one of the many Jewish-owned furniture stores and secondhand stores that operated mostly on Clarence and on Byward. There were tinsmiths in the market. Several of them operated, again, mostly on Clarence Street, making furnace pipes, pails, pots and pans, stove pipes, and garbage cans. Those included Morris Phelan, several in the Applebaum family, and Adolph Davis. Then there was Slover's department store, founded by Frank Slover. His first retail clothing business was named F. Slover Limited and was located at 69 Sussex. By 1918, Frank moved his business to the corner of William and York, sort of where Tucker's Marketplace is today, but they had the whole building. Slover's continued to grow, and Frank's son Lawrence took over the management in 1936. Frank Slover's grandson, also named Frank, started working at the store on Saturdays when he was 12 years old. There's a common theme here. Lily started working at 12, I started working at 12, probably Joel did, and now we hear about Frank Slover as well. Frank recalled that his grandfather was among the first merchants to run a fixed price store in the market. Before him, there were no price tags. Everyone haggled over price for each purchase. With the growth of shopping malls and national department stores, Slovers suffered the fate of most homegrown department stores and closed in the late 1970s. In this page from the 1931 Ottawa Journal, it describes the reopening of the store, including the new second floor after a fire. This story and the ad took up 3 consecutive pages of that day's newspaper and was a major event in the retail history of Ottawa. Another long-standing institution was Toronto Hardware, located at the corner of Dalhousie and Clarence. It's not there now, it's currently a cannabis store. Tells you how things have changed. It served the market for about 60 years until it was sold in the late 1970s. On the right side of the screen, you see specials from that store in honor of Mayor Stanley Lewis's birthday in February of 1936. It was part of a special promotion where you gained admission to the party. I think it was held at the Capitol Theatre, being held in the mayor's honor if you brought with you a pot or a pan, which would go to a needy family. Slovers and several other stores participated in this promotion. Slovers advertised aluminum kitchenware for 59 cents each. Sadly, the glory days of retail in the market are behind us. And even my family business, which dates back 7 years, will probably be closing this fall, as numerous factors have combined to make the type of business that thrived in the past century unsustainable going forward. As previously mentioned, this presentation only scratches the surface. There was so much more in the rich history of the Jewish presence in the market, from candy manufacturers to pawn shops to furniture stores, but there is only so much that can be done in one presentation on one evening. And in doing this and researching, I found probably 100 newspaper articles which I clipped. I probably have about 150 pictures, so there's certainly lots more material out there. Just want to mention these books that you see here that were very helpful for me in putting this together. On the left, a wonderful account of that period in Ottawa is the biography of Sylvia Badowski-Kirschman, whose book Lifelines and Other Lines by itself has enough in its second chapter dealing with settlement in downtown Ottawa to fill a presentation. I think the book's available for sale here tonight as well. Sylvia passed away in January of this year at the age of 98 and was a longtime member of the Historical Society and lived through so much of our community's history. We are so fortunate to have had her share her memories with us. Her book is a great resource for learning about Jewish community life in Ottawa. The book in the middle was put together by Gerald Lando, who was an avid genealogist, and he did an amazing job researching hundreds of Jewish families that lived in Ottawa and how everybody is related to everybody else. It's fascinating. Not quite incestuous, but maybe close. The book on the right is The Common Thread, which is basically the history of the Ottawa Jewish community. Finally, I would like to thank Tegan Goldsmith, who's already been thanked tonight, but she deserves a lot of thanks and praise. She is the very talented and resourceful archivist of the Ottawa Jewish Archives and is also the executive director of the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society. As someone interested in our community history, I'm very grateful to Tegan for the fine work she does to preserve and share our treasures of the past. I encourage any of you with an interest in the rich history of our community to Take advantage of the archives, and as Terry said, please join the Historical Society, which will allow us to continue to record and share the treasures of the past. Thank you again for coming up this evening.
At this point, I'd like to invite everybody to help themselves to refreshments. There's drinks. No, we're not done yet. And we're going to take a 10-minute break, a little longer, and then we're going to open the floor to questions, and John will answer questions, and we'll hear from Ross later on. Please, everybody, help yourselves.
Wow. All right, we're gonna go starting with the time. If anyone has a question, please put your hand up and John will select you. Do I have the first question for John on the Byward market? Alternatively, if you have a story to tell, please put your hand up.
Does anybody have any questions, or does anybody want to tell a story or an anecdote about their time in the market? Okay, I see somebody.
I was wondering with all of the Jewish families that own one business in Margaret, who owned the business and all the Jews took over? And what was in the market, in other words, before the Jewish influence?
The market area was basically where the Jewish community lived, the Irish Canadians, and the French Canadians. So before the Jews, it was just basically the Irish Canadians and the French Canadians. Anybody else? Comment, question, criticism?
John?
I don't have a question, it's a comment, but Sam's under. I used to go to the health club downtown on Chapel, and after we would work out, Sam was often there, and he wanted to live back in the store. And so I put him in the car, he couldn't drive, and I turned, and he said, "Glenn, you turned the wrong way." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "No, I know," and he knew exactly how to get there, and he couldn't see.
He was market. Mrs. Berkman?
Yeah.
Okay, Claire.
So you did show a photo of the Ottawa Chocolate Tour, and it brought back a lot of very happy memories. However, getting to Vader from York Street School was a nightmare. We got beaten and stoned and named and called 32 every time we went to Vader. And I'm sure there's many people in the audience that are going to benefit that. It wasn't a happy time.
I do, Claire. Anybody else? Yes, a couple of people.
Just wondering, as a follow-up to the question of who's there before you. Who's there now?
Okay, the question is, who is in the market now, since most of the Jewish businesses are gone? Well, as you know, the market is a big entertainment area now, bars and restaurants. Some of them doing very well, some of them not doing well. As far as retail, there's not a whole lot left. On our block, which was almost 100% Jewish, as when I was a kid, most of the stores now are owned by Lebanese Canadians. It's just different groups, they come over more recently and they basically all our immigrants and do the same thing that our.
Just to interrupt, my apologies, but something with the white car license plate BXPJ 276 is a white BMW. If you can move your car to clear the way, that would be fantastic. Thank you so much. Back to the program.
Anybody else? Harvey, move your car.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Friedman, which makes Jacob Friedman my great grandfather. Two short stories about him. Sitting on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, he once bought all the futures for butter in Plymouth Market on the entire eastern coast of the United States. So that was helpful to him. And as we live in a time where anti-Semitism is rising again, a flip story, Jacob Friedman's entire fortune was based on the fact that when he first came to Ottawa and started as a peddler, a farmer who was not Jewish gave him $200 worth of eggs on consignment. And he managed to sell that, and that really was the cornerstone of his entire growth.
Thank you, Jonathan. I should say something about Jonathan. The historical plaque that I showed on the screen commemorating Jacob Friedman, there's actually a box that controls the mechanism that does our roll down shutter that we had painted by an artist a few years ago. And because we're not a butcher shop, the artist put a pig there. And Jonathan came to me many years ago and said, how can you put a pig above the pig?
Yeah, my name is Joe Silverman. My grandfather, Ben Silverman, came from Odessa, Ukraine in 1912 and opened up a watchmaking store on Clarence. And my father grew up above it. He was pictured in at the Talmud Torah in front, standing with his hands behind his back at 10 years old. Anyways, that tradition of watchmaking was passed on to his son, who operated Dominion Jewelers on Dell House, just around the corner. Max Silverman and his wife, Sonny Silverman, lived above the store. And my grandfather's watch table and all his paraphernalia, Ben Silverman's watchmaker, are in the displayed in the exhibit in the National Museum of Clocks and Watches in Deep Earth Rock area. So my father went on to serve in the Canadian Air Force. He joined 2 weeks after 1939, the start of the Second World War. And joined the Air Force. He was a field gunner, a rear gunner on a compact bomber, and he flew 36 miraculous missions. If you want to see a compact bomber and a field gunner, you can visit it at the Trenton National Museum of Aviation. They have a Halifax bomber that has been retrieved from the lake in Norway that was lost in 1943. And now it's on exhibit there. And I am now going to celebrate the 80th anniversary of D-Day on June the 6th, 2024, in a week's time. Because we want to honor my parents. And my father met my mother on the dance floor at Hunter Gardens in June 6, 1944, 80 years ago. And she is being honored as a war bride because her picture, her wedding picture, standing beside my father in uniform, and her wedding dress made by her mother and me is going to be on display at the new Juno Beach Center exhibition in Juno Beach Center on June 4th. My sister and myself will be attending that ceremony. And my mother's will be featured as a war bride in the exhibit called Canada's New Face, Faces of Canada Today. My mother will be featured as the Faces of Canada in her day. Thank you.
My exercise.
Market area, because there were other Jewish people who ran businesses in Ottawa quite a number of years ago. There was one business in center town by the name of Lowmore Printers. And I'll just tell you a couple of stories. I'll try to be as brief as possible. I was telling the members at Mount Seeking when I was observing my father's foremothers birthside. And my dad was sitting in the office at Lowmore Printers. He was in it, he worked as a compositor, and he was part owner of Lowmore Printers. That's where you people here in Ottawa got your Jewish home directories. And of course, Lowmore did a lot of business for High Hodge for the Jewish Community Center. But anyway, Rabbi Eckstein, remember Eckstein? Anyway, Rabbi Eckstein was sitting in his office, in my dad's office, and I was about 18 years of age, decades ago, and saw Rabbi Eckstein was going to get a ticket, so I ran into my dad's office and I said, "Hey, Rabbi, you're going to get a ticket. You better hurry and get to your car." Well, when we were going home, my dad and my father turned to me in the car and he said, "Don't you ever, ever, ever say hey to a rabbi." Just one of the I think a lot of you here know the Lori was the one that stayed. Well, Nellie used to be good friends of mine. And when Nellie and Percy got married, just before they got married, my dad printed the wedding invitations. Shaw, he was sitting on the linotype in the wet slugs, the wedding invitations in Hebrew for Percy and Miller's wedding invitations. That was one of the things.
Hi, I'm Debbie Yates. Closer. I'm Debbie Yates. My grandfather was Jacob Ages the Iceman. My father was a pilot on those Halifax and Lancaster bombers, and he lost many rear gunners. In answer to the question someone asked about what the market was before, it was a cattle market. It was an agricultural market. There used to be gigantic weigh scales for cattle, for dairy and beef cattle. And what was the third thing? My father drove the real ice truck. Every morning he had to deliver ice before he went to Nepean High School. He was 13. They didn't believe in licenses in those days. And the last thing I want to say is my grandmother had a secondhand store
on William Street. She had 3 daughters and she was a widow. Part of her family came from Europe. And they were 3 adults and 8 kids living in 2 rooms above this little secondhand store. And now families have not enough room to accommodate guests sometimes, and it's sad.
I think listening to all these stories, we hear how important the archives and the Historical Society are, because these memories have to be preserved. We all like to hear the stories, but it's these organizations that are preserving and saving them for future generations.
My name is Maxine Penalski, formerly modern. Before you had a public sweet mine, before that was there, you drove. I was a shop again, one on the road. And our cousin, our great grandfather had his tailor shop there. And it was David, not 1911, the archives. But then I was torn down to new shops.
Clearly, there were so many businesses, so many different types of businesses, and the hardest part of doing the presentation was trying to decide what I could include. But there's obviously so much more.
Well, the meat business wasn't just down in Byward Market. The meat business was also in the West End. Your dad, my dad, Jack Firestone, and Barry Davis used to talk share notes all the time. My dad's store was called the Meat Market on Wellington Street. Hello? Jeez. 1101 Wellington, by the way. So my dad and I worked there. Remember the rolling wieners, sausages, and hamburger food pound packages and so on. And it was an amazing time, but our parents, our dads spoke all the time. They came over together. It was about a full day. And it's a great memory. And I started working at 12 years old as well. And all my non-Jewish buddies used to party. Oh, you got to come. And the ones that get close.
Just to echo what Sam just said, my father after supper every night told me, get me Jack on the phone. And it was 728-3920. I was, I don't know, I've done it so many times. It was 100 years ago. 100 years.
Yeah. So John was talking about how you have to control. You have to lay out the dollar bills in order. And I used to stand up on Saturday. Yeah, and I used to stand there. I used to lay out the $1 bills, the $2 bills, the $5 bills, the $10 bills. I used to stand there. And I had a look at that. I said, what's that? That's I.
They have a hiding center. They can't have it on the bills.
On behalf of everyone who came out tonight, we extend our heartfelt gratitude for all your efforts, hard work, researching, and then sharing this fascinating history of Byward Market and its rich heritage. Your insights and stories were brought to light an important chapter of our city. It also promoted or prompted us to reflect on our own memories, connections, and multiple links with the Byward market. For me, you transported me back to a moment, June of 1957. My first trip to Camp Neighbor. The scene was one of bedlam, unbridled chaos. The sea of people spanning generations from great-grandparents to newborns, to the hundreds upon hundreds of children and their parents. Camper trucks thrown in the back of trucks, while the buses lined up one after the other, ready for their departure. The air is thick with emotion, fear, joy, excitement, hugs and kisses, last-minute advice, words of encouragement, reminders. There's self-addressed envelopes in your trunk and right home. And the tears of fear of the first-year campers, and the tears of joy in our parents who had the summer off. And all this took place in one street within the confines of the Byward market. One of many memories that I have. Thank you again, John, for enlightening us, engaging us through a journey through time which has rekindled an appreciation for what was once the cultural heart of our city. As well, thank you for bringing up the significant contributions of the Jewish community to Mark's development and its cultural value. It's my pleasure on behalf of the Byward Jewish Historical Society to present you with a donation to the Diener Fund as a way of saying thanks. God bless.
That concludes the formal part of this evening. For those of you who wish to do so, who might want to kibitz a little bit, there's still some fruit refreshments. Please help yourselves. Visit our merchandise booth before you leave. And don't forget that there's a donation jar in the front lobby. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. I hope you enjoyed it.